Welcome everyone. This is the Bush Heritage Australia Wildflowers in the West webinar. I hope you're enjoying your afternoon, and in just a short time we'll get to the presentation which we're all here to join. But I'll just introduce myself. My name's Alex Hams. I'm the Healthy Landscapes Manager for the southwest of Western Australia. I've been in the role just a short time now, but I've been really excited to be a part of the Bush Heritage team, particularly with my family having a long association with the landscape that I'm working with. It's a very special part of the world, and I'm really excited to be able to help conserve that with our partners, as well as some of the great staff. And Angela and Libby, who I'll introduce shortly, have had a big role in being a part of this restoration and the conservation effort in this landscape. And I hope you enjoy the day and the presentation and all of the information that's associated with it. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on which land which we're meeting. For us, that's the Menang people. Past the elders and past, present and emerging. I'll invite you now, if you know the traditional name of the land that you're sitting on, please type that into the chat box as we go along. It's always interesting to see the different traditional owner groups that are present and managing the landscapes around Australia and a lot of the different areas that Bush Heritage works on. In terms of the format for today, I'm just about to introduce you to Angela Sanders, who will give you an overview of the presentation and some of the information around the presenter, Libby Sandiford. Libby will then present Angela will then present Libby to do the presentation, and following that presentation, we've got an opportunity to do a Q&A to answer any of the questions that you have. Within the setup, we've got a Q&A function so that you can post any questions that you have of Libby, Angela or myself. And please feel free to use the chat box for any general comments that you have about this presentation or anything that you hear about today. If you're having any technical issues at all, please email events@bushheritage.org.au. We'll try and resolve those as soon as we can. And just to remind everyone that we will be recording this webinar and we'll be emailing a link to that, link to everyone who's participating in this webinar in a few days' time, so that you can watch that or send it on to anyone else who you think might enjoy this information. So just moving on to the purpose and the topic of the webinar. Obviously, Bush Heritage is an organisation that buys and manages land across Australia. We partner with Aboriginal people and other groups to protect some of the important and irreplaceable landscapes that we work on. And particularly important to protect and conserve some of the native species here forever as well. Our reserves and our partnerships help protect threatened ecosystems and over 6,700 species of plants and animals on those landscapes, including at least 226 threatened species, which is just phenomenal when you think about some of those numbers. Our purpose is obviously to bring the bush back to good health. It's really important for us as an organisation, and I'm sure it's a really important aspect that our supporters obviously support us to help deliver. We work on our reserves and also in partnerships with, as I said, traditional owners, but also landholders surrounding those areas. And it's really important that we share this information and some of the achievements that we are able to deliver through these partnerships with our supporters through these webinars. And we really hope to engage and inspire a deeper connection for yourself and others and each other through these presentations. Angela and Libby have both been working on this landscape for quite some time together, and Libby has been doing some vegetation surveys across this area including the most recent one at Baringa, one of our properties within the Fitz Stirling landscape, which was completed just this year thanks to some support from the state NRM office. So it's really great to see now all of our properties now have vegetation surveys on them, and Angela and Libby will be able to provide you some information about what's involved in that. Now, I'm going to introduce you to Angela Sanders, who's an ecologist with Bush Heritage. She's been working with us for over 10 years and decades, in fact, within this landscape as an ecologist. She's really got a wealth of knowledge, and I'll hand it over to Ange to introduce Libby and explain a little bit about the landscape that we're working with. Thanks, Ange.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alex, and welcome to everyone. It's great to be on this seminar this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to give a background and just let you know about the area that we're working in. And okay, that's the slide that I wanted. So we're working in this area, we're working in between the Stirling Range and the Fitzgerald River National Parks. So it's a stretch of about 70 kilometres, and there are quite a few conservation reserves in that area. There are also privately owned reserves, and you can see those on the map as yellow properties there. Our properties are in orange, and the remnant vegetation is in green. And all the white areas that you see before you, that's cleared farmland. So the idea in this area is to reconnect to those two national parks by revegetating some of that farmland across that link there. So there's unallocated Crown land, there's privately owned farms, there's quite a lot of different tenures through that area. It's fairly low in relief, so we don't have any high mountains. There are some in the Stirling Range National Park, but the area that we're working in is fairly low relief. We have a few undulations with some creek lines running through. They run south to the south coast. And we've also got 3 partnerships at the moment through that area. So we don't own all those properties. We actually go into partnership with some of the other landowners, and we assist them to manage their property. And we're going to be developing further partnerships with other people and some of the Noongar managed land in the near future. So that's something that's coming up for us. So we started working in this area in 2004 with our Cheraninup property, and we've now been involved in over 1,300 hectares of restoration and revegetation and the creation of fauna habitat. So we've been working in this area for quite a while. And this gives you a little bit of a background of what Libby's going to talk to you about. But I'd really now like to introduce Libby Sandiford, who is a botanist of high regard and very experienced botanist, and she's been working on the south coast of WA now for over 30 years. And she carried out her first flora and vegetation survey for us in 2013. And I've been working with her. I've been really fortunate to have been on a lot of those surveys, and we've been walking across the land, finding new plants. We found malleefowl mounds, and we found lots of Aboriginal cultural artefacts across these properties. So when we first purchased the properties, when we started in 2004, we knew that we were working in a biodiversity hotspot, but we had absolutely no idea just how biodiverse these properties are. And it wasn't until Libby started her work that we started to realise just what we had in these properties out there. So as well as doing the flora and vegetation work, Libby has compiled a herbarium for us. So there's about 800 species in there now and counting. There's more being added to that all the time. And this herbarium is available for everyone to access. So Libby is going to talk to you today about the flora and vegetation of the properties that I've just mentioned and the remarkable biodiversity on them. So I'll hand over to Libby.
Hello and good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about some of the Bush Heritage Survey work I've been involved with in the last 7 years in the southwest of WA. This work was undertaken initially to provide an inventory of flora and vegetation to enable bush heritage to effectively manage their reserves for biodiversity values. I'll talk about the plants first, then the vegetation, and briefly some implications. So, where are we? This is a map of all of Bush Heritage Australia's reserves and partnerships, with the star showing the location of the reserves I'll be talking about. If you look at a closer map, which is the same one as Angela's just showed you, you'll see the Bush Heritage maps in teal blue. The three southern reserves that I'll concentrate on are Mongebup and Yarrawaya, which is a privately owned conservation estate on which Bush Heritage does quite a bit of monitoring. There's Red Mort and Mongebup North. And to the northeast, the two other reserves I'll touch briefly on are Cheraninup and Baringa. Their presence, along with a string of remnants between the Fitzgerald River and Stirling Range National Park, combined with the Palinup River and the coastal corridors, were the original impetus behind the Gondwana Link concept, which is reconnecting the southwest forests to the inland woodlands via restoration. It was the location of these properties in this link, along with the presence of vegetation in excellent condition, that prompted Bush Heritage to acquire the properties. All of the properties share similar geological histories and landforms, being underlain by the edge of the Archean-Yilgarn Shield, overlaid with exposures of Eocene marine sediments, which I'll refer to as spongilites, and other weathered crusts and erosional deposits. I won't go into too much detail about the methods of the survey, but I think it's important to say it involved a lot of fieldwork and that this was essential for the ultimate findings. So this is a map here of Red Mort Reserve, and it gives you an idea of the extent of the work, with the lines representing field tracks and the dots survey sites. Now, whilst those tracks may appear random, they were initially planned to cover any apparent variation, either in vegetation type, soil or landform, as evident on aerial photography or any other maps that we had. Within the survey sites, the structure, the dominant and common plants, along with physical data, were recorded and then later used to analyse to assist determining the vegetation communities. So the first area that we surveyed was Mongebup Yarrawaya. This was the most dissected of the landscape of the reserves, with several creeks, lots of granite exposure, but very little spongilite. 570 native species were recorded, which was much more than I expected. And as I was walking through the bush, many plants seemed to me to be a bit unusual for the area. Later analysis of distribution data indicated that a quarter of the species recorded were at or beyond known range limits. 18 conservation species were recorded, 12 of which were new records for the reserve, including the largest known and healthiest population of Gastrolobium humile, which is one of the poison plants. So it's a plant that contains 1080. Another unexpected find was the presence of Kunzia nubii, a plant unknown to me at the time, and as it turns out, just about everyone. This species is named after its discoverer, Ken Newby, an extraordinary local botanist and prolific collector. It was described from just only one collection in the lower Palinup Valley, indicated by the red dot on the map, with the black cross being roughly the location of the reserve. Somehow its rarity had been overlooked and it had no conservation status at the time of this survey and thus wasn't on anyone's radar. It's now recognised as a Priority 1 conservation species, which in WA is just a level below threatened. The following year, we surveyed Red Mort Reserve, previously known as Mongebup Creek, and I naively thought that not much would be different given that it lies within 3 to 13 kilometres southeast of Mongebup Yarrawaya. The area is more subdued than Mongebup and Yarrawaya, which is possibly reflected in the lower number of native species recorded, 438. But surprisingly, over a quarter of these, so 116, were not recorded on Mongebup Yarrawaya. You'd expect some differences in species, assuming that you'd missed some, but over 100 was surprising. The most notable of the 8 conservation species recorded, which were all new records, were the extensive stands of this beautiful eucalyptus, Eucalyptus vesiculosa, or red mort, a local endemic from which the reserve subsequently took its name. Monjabup North was the next survey, and again I thought, well, we can't find too much different, given its proximity to the other reserves. It turned out to be the most diverse of the southern reserves, with 591 native species, including 20 conservation species, 8 of which were not found on either Monjabup Yarrawaya or Red Mort Reserve. And again, 100 species were not recorded on the 2 other reserves. Amongst the conservation species, the most surprising finding was the presence of a large patch of the threatened Alocasiarina tortoramula, which represents a range extension of over 150 kilometres to the southwest, with previous records near Lake King, one of which is suspected of being an introduction. So overall, a very high floristic diversity was found across the 3 reserves, with over 800 species in less than 3,000 hectares. What was surprising to me was only a third of the species were recorded on all of the 3 reserves. Just under a third were restricted to 1 reserve and the rest shared by 2. This high species turnover over very small distances, known as beta diversity, is, however, not unusual or extraordinary in the southwest. Indeed, higher diversity has been recorded in smaller areas, noticeably those areas associated with clay-based wetlands. Across the 3 reserves, 30 conservation species, including 5 threatened and 25 priority species, were recorded, 2/3 being new records for the reserves. Just under a quarter of the species occurred at or beyond known range limits, with roughly 3/4 of these representing species either typical of drier or more northerly distributions, such as this tiny annual. I hope you can see it, because all I can see is my face on this slide. Or of species occurring in a similar climate but with a more easterly distribution, thus at their western limit within the survey area. So the red dots on the maps here represent WA herbarium collections, and the black dot the reserve's locations. The remaining were either typical of wetter southwest areas or plants with a more coastal distribution, so appearing in the inland limit, or localised species, as this little tetratheca. Looking briefly at the 2 northern reserves, an additional 136 species were recorded, including 1 additional threatened and 5 additional priority species. Discoveries included the largest known populations of this tiny threatened orchid, which you really need to have to stand on to see, just about, it's so small. This sedge, which I got quite excited about, having never seen it before, and though it turns out not to be new, it represents a southerly range extension of over 270 kilometres. Another priority conservation species recorded was this beautiful local endemic, Thelymytris ongera, and we collected on both reserves what appears to be a new species, this Aleria. In total, now 935 species have been recorded in the 5 reserves in less than 5,000 hectares. To provide some regional perspective on the diversity of this total, it currently represents 58% of known species within the Fitzgerald River National Park, occurring in 1.5% of the area. For those of you unfamiliar with the Fitzgerald River National Park, it's recognised as one of the most diverse parks in Western Australia in terms of flora. Though what these figures really tell me is that there's bound to be many more species in the Fitz. Despite numerous surveys, there are large areas of the Fitz that haven't been surveyed. And what we found in these surveys is that many plants, including widespread species, can be very sparsely distributed. Possibly as many as 50 species that we recorded were only observed from 1 plant or from a patch of a few plants. Thus, they're very hard to detect. On a wider scale, the number of species in the newly configured southwest floristic region represents 11.5% of the area in 0.01% of the area, though new species are being found here regularly. For those of you who are interstate, some of the comparisons that might be relevant are Wilson's Promontory in Victoria has just over 900 species, Fraser Island in Queensland 918, and Royal National Park in New South Wales around 1200. If you look at the vegetation on the reserves, you'll see that there's a very similar pattern. High diversity, similar units, but also significant differences between the reserves. So around 20 units have been described on the 3 southern reserves, with an additional 5 to 7 on Cheraninup and Baringa. You might wonder why these figures are not precise, but until an overall analysis or indeed even a regional survey is done, it's hard to know if what's not seen on one reserve is distinct or just a variation of a broader regional unit. Mostly, there were a lot of mallees, as shown here. There was a range of woodlands and forests associated with either breakaways or the creek lines, a range of shrublands and sheoak woodland associated with the granites, and a variety of lower shrublands on the shallow soils. This map here is a simplified vegetation map of the 3 southern reserves with similar units represented by the same colour and the diagonal stripes being mosaics of 2 units. So broadly, the blues are creek vegetation, the brighter pinks are mallee and shrublands associated with the shallow soils over spongilite, the reds and orange are units associated with granites, the greens and yellow are a variety of mallee units, although you need to ignore the very pale green mallee, which is a mapping unit where the vegetation was not determined, either due to disturbance or insufficiency of aim, and the greys, browns and skin pinks, tree units on slopes and breakaways. So if you look at Monjabup and Yarrawaya, you can see it's dominated by the granite heaths in red, along with the sheoak and woodland in orange. There's very little mallet or mort woodlands, but it does include a very tiny patch of this Eucalyptus arborella woodland on top of a mesa. In fact, although the arrow points to that grey patch, there's actually a black dot within that, which is this little patch of woodland. This vegetation is only known from some areas within here and within the Fitzgerald River National Park. There's also an area of proteaceous-rich threatened ecological community on the northern boundary. If we look at red mort, there's similar vegetation, but there's also areas of York gum in the purple, which are significant because these occur near the south-east limit of this widespread species. I'm hoping that you can see the black dot there. There's patches of upland Yates swamp, and there's some Eucalyptus melanophytra forest, a local endemic along a major minor drainage line. And there's extensive bands of what we call in the west mallet woodland that associated with the breakaways and slopes. These mallet woodlands are actually unusual in form, usually consisting of a monotypic stand with no understory. So that is, there's only one species present. On red mort, these are either Eucalyptus platypus, vesiculosa, astringens, and occasionally melanophytra. An unusual feature of these mallets on red mort was the spatial distribution of the units, best described as random. Though some patterns are evident, with platypus usually lower in the landscape on the clay soils and astringens on the upper breakaways, there were many areas where you'd walk across a slope with no apparent difference in soil or landform, and you might pass from a patch of vesiculosa into platypus, back to vesiculosa, into astringens, etc., etc., big patches and small patches. This pattern was made all the more confusing by the stem size and density of the patches, from the very small ones, shown here, through to the medium-sized trees, and occasionally to the very large patches. After a day of trying to work out these patterns, this is what it all looks like. And often my head was spinning trying to work them out. On Monjabup North, the major differences in the vegetation were the large areas of shrublands, including Kunzia nubii shrublands associated with the shallow soils on spongilites, the extensive areas of mallee heath with Banksia media in the light green, and extensive areas of mallee on spongilites. There was no York gum and no sheoak woodland. So if you look at the map overall, it's actually easy to see that no one reserve here would adequately conserve the local vegetation. Like the flora, there was local endemic vegetation. Some units occurred at their range limits, and there was one threatened ecological community, the proteaceous-rich shrublands. So what does it all mean for bush heritage? Having this baseline data means they can now manage their reserves for conservation effectively. Prior to this survey, the best vegetation map, oops, not happening. Okay, we need the next slide. Okay, thank you. The best vegetation data they had across all three reserves was Ken Newby's regional vegetation map done in the 70s, which covers a large area of the central south coast and hinterland. You can see from Newby's map that he found the same general patterns that I have, but there are significant differences, which I attribute largely to method and scale. I'm also convinced that Newby did not traverse these remnants, but interpreted them from aerial photography, which is a technique I found of very limited value in southern WA. So on Red Mort, you can see in the purple circle, he didn't find any York gum, though he was well aware of this vegetation. He also missed the extensive bands of mallets. Similar discrepancies occur on the other reserves. So whilst Newby's regional map is adequate to detect general patterns and broad vegetation diversity, it may lead to bad management on a local scale. For example, if Bush Heritage wanted to survey for phascogales, which is a small arboreal mammal, they would target areas of sheoak in that orange circle and might visit, say, this area, only to find that there was very little sheoak, so it'd be a waste of time and money. Similarly, they might be concerned that one veg type is of only one age class and decide to burn a portion of mallee, say here, only to discover that they've burnt. Oh, is it coming up? Yes, sorry. That they've burnt all the proteaceous threatened ecological community, which would not be a good idea. So having detailed local data is essential for managing biodiversity values. Previous versions of this talk, given in WA, were titled Just a Bit of Bush, because on first impressions, these reserves appear pretty ordinary. A bit of leftover bush that, for whatever reasons, were not cleared and look much like any other bush in the area. But as you have discovered, looks can deceive. Here in the southwest, these little bits of leftover bush are incredibly important in terms of plant conservation, as so much has been cleared. So for Bush Heritage, who didn't know what was on the properties when they bought them, other than having intact vegetation and occurring in the Fitz Stirling corridor, it looks like they've hit a jackpot. For the rest of us, it's exciting because there's just so much more out there waiting to be discovered. So thank you, and also thank you to the wonderful volunteers who have helped me, especially Linda, Jane and Bill.
Fantastic. That was a brilliant presentation, Libby. I think there was some really fantastic information in there. And I'm sure that we've got some sensational questions from some of our listeners out there in Webland to be able to ask you. I'm really astounded by the number of species that you've just described there, and over 935 species across our 5 reserves within this area. It's just absolutely phenomenal, and I still can't get my head around how many of those species there are. And it seems that you obviously have to know a lot of different species to be able to determine those out in the field. So obviously you've got a lot of experience doing botany, but do you want to describe sort of some of the background in terms of learning some of those species and how you go about doing it when you were out in the field?
Well, I'm pretty passionate about plants, and I have lived on this coast for 30 years, so you do build up a knowledge. But I also have to admit that after the first 2 reserves, I did think to myself, have I made an awful blunder here and doubled up the data? But in fact, we haven't. And there's a lot of yeah, okay.
No, that's great. I've got a question here from Peter, who mentioned that he's only ever heard the word breakaway in WA, and it seems to have something to do with a small cliff or going down into a gully, but he's not too sure exactly what that means. Do either of you two want to describe what it is and the significance of those sort of landscapes within our reserves that we're working on?
Yeah, I can answer that one, Alex. So the breakaway we use to describe a landform that is oh gosh, it's like a mesa or a formation that has got quite a steep slope and a flat top, and it it occurs up in the upper landscape. So it's sort of a special formation. Often they're spongilite and sometimes degraded granite, but there's a steep slope and then a flat top to them. Sometimes they're circular on top. Sometimes they're ridges that will go for quite a few kilometres across a property. So that's generally what we call a breakaway.
Fantastic. Question 2 coming in now. So this is from Jane. Do your reserves support greater and more diverse insect and animal populations?
That's a really good question. Not necessarily. So probably insects, yes, because a lot of the plants have specific insect pollinators, especially the orchids. But certainly as far as vertebrate fauna go, it's not a really highly diverse area of Australia for vertebrates. We've got a high number of, suppose, honey eaters, so honey eater pollinators. We've got 13 species, which is quite unusual. But for the rest of the fauna, no, it's not exceptionally diverse, because a lot of the birds are more keyed into the structure of the vegetation rather than the floristics.
Fantastic. I've got a question for both of you, which is an interesting one. In terms of wildflowers, do either of you have a favourite species, and if so, what would it be?
I don't think I have a favourite. There's too many.
Just like a good mother, don't want to differentiate a favourite child.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so, same for me. There are just so many beautiful plants. I just couldn't possibly pick a favourite.
Fantastic. Look, we're coming towards the end of our presentation. I want to make a very special thank you to both of you for presenting and making yourselves available to all of our supporters. I have a final question here from Joanne, which is that it's fantastic to hear about all the great diversity in across the landscape here. This question is specifically to Libby. Did you survey for weed species as well? And if so, what sort of species did you find, and what could you conclude about weeds that we've found on the reserves?
Okay, we did record weed species where they occurred within the remnants, because these properties also have cleared areas, so obviously have a lot of weedy species. I think we probably recorded about 50. Generally, these were limited to the creek valleys or the edges of the reserves. Most of the remnants were in really, really good condition.
Yeah, it's pretty important to note that most of our reserves as well are majority of the reserves are in native vegetation, either have been a remnant or have come back as revegetation or regeneration of some initially cleared landscapes. So we actually don't have a lot of issues with weeds on the landscape, which is fantastic. Another question here from Clint. He's based in Bremer Bay, just to the south and slightly to the east of the landscape that we're working in. He says, I love the area and its unique plants and wildlife. Are you acquiring more properties in the corridor between the Stirling and Fitzgerald National Park? Do either of you two want to answer that, or?
Yeah, well, that is our aim, is to acquire more properties. Certainly, we'd like to, and also we're working hard on working in partnership with other landowners to get better conservation outcomes for that land as well.
I'll probably add to that just to say that obviously to achieve the vision of the connectivity between the two national parks, it's really important that we do continue to work with our neighbouring landholders and look to acquire new properties to do revegetation to make that connection. Probably it's really important to make sure that we do have that connectivity for some of those cryptic species like the red-tailed phascogale that was mentioned in Libby's presentation. I've got another question here from Cullen. Has there been any fungi or microbial surveys done on these reserves? Maybe this is a good one for you, Ange.
Yeah, certainly. We've had a couple of volunteers do a fungi survey on Cherranina quite some years ago now. And of course, you have to have fairly wet or damp conditions for surveying fungi, but we have got a fair few people interested in doing that on our reserves, so we've got a little bit of information. And right at the moment, we're having some soil samples analysed for the microorganisms in the soil. So we're doing a DNA scan of the soils to see what sort of organisms are living in them. So we're actually comparing the re-vegged areas with the remnant areas and also with the naturally regenerating areas on our properties, as well as the disturbed areas such as the fire breaks. So we should have some results by the middle of next year on that, and hopefully we can use that information to improve the way we do our restoration on the next property we purchase.
Excellent, thanks. This one is from Bev and Jenny. Libby, how long did the surveys take for you to do?
Well, I spent at least 30 days in the field. On top of that, there was probably, actually, I'm not really sure, probably up to about 4 days for each day in the field. First of all, identifying the plants that you didn't know or needed checking out in the herbarium in Perth, collating lists, collating photos. The hardest part probably was the vegetation work, working out what vegetation you did actually have. One of the dangers is trying to split stuff up into too finer details so people can't recognise them. So you want your map to try and reflect regional patterns, but without any other data outside, that's a little bit tricky. And then actually putting lines on a map is even harder. So quite some time, probably a couple of months each year for the last 7 years.
Fantastic. Such a big area to work in, and such, as you mentioned in your presentation, so many different and diverse parts of that landscape. So there's quite an intensity involved in doing those surveys, I'm sure. This next question is from Erica. When working with local landholders, you provide them with a list of plants to look out for, and then a way in which they can provide feedback to you if they do happen to find some of these species?
No, we haven't got into that sort of detail yet because, as Libby pointed out earlier, every property is different. So we'd be able to walk around with them, which we do quite often, and point out some of the more common species. Our Department of Conservation keeps a record of all the threatened species, and they work with landowners on particular threatened species, so we don't do that. But we're certainly able to provide information on the vegetation types they've got on their property and some guidance on how to manage those.
Fabulous. This question's from Kashmir, and this is probably something that we can all address to some extent. Are we going to collect seed from these reserves to revegetate the corridor? I'll jump in first if you like. If we do revegetation within this landscape, we really want to be able to utilise local provenance seed. So absolutely, some of the seed will be collected from some of the reserves that we manage in the landscape. There are limited opportunities for seed collection in our landscape as a result of restrictions within national parks and other areas. There are some capacity for us to pick some seed from road reserves, which is really important because they are tended to be quite wide and have a similar high diversity of species within them. But absolutely, that if we did purchase new farmland to continue that corridor, these are some of the areas that we'd be focusing on for our seed collection. Did either of you two want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things I think that is quite useful from these surveys is that given we've got so many things at the range limit or range extensions, we could actually now use those species identified in restoration work in a bid to mitigate predicted climate change effects without actually introducing species that don't occur, which I think is quite important.
That's a fabulous point. Thanks for that, Libby.
And one of the things I would like to add is that we've done a little bit of an analysis, and of all the species that Libby has mentioned, we can actually get less than 20% of those back into our restoration because we don't know, A, how to collect the seed or how to regenerate them, and we don't know the techniques that they need to germinate. So we there's a lot of research is needed, and to get all those species back into our restoration, we're quite a very long way from that at the moment.
I can perhaps also add just a few little things there. So if you looked at all those species that we have, around 50% of them are shrubs, only 5% are trees, 10% are grasses, sedges or rushes, but 33% are either annuals or geophytes or perennial herbs. So they're the small little things, but it's quite a high number when you think about it, that really haven't even been gone into restoration at all.
Fabulous. I've got one or two more questions, but just need to acknowledge that we're just about out of time. This question is from Clint. Do you actively manage fire regimes on the reserve? And has there been impacts on the biodiversity from any of the recent fire activity?
I can answer Alex, yeah. So no, there hasn't been any impact at all on any of our properties from the recent fires. We've had some fairly small fires, mainly lightning-started fires on the properties in the past decade or two, and they're very quickly extinguished by the local landowners. So our properties are in fact what we call long unburnt, which is really long unburnt, so greater than 70 years, and in some cases maybe longer than that. So we have got some collapse of some of the proteaceous species in those areas. So we are now looking at getting or trying to include some traditional burning on our properties to do some very small scale cool burns to try and regenerate some of those proteaceous species especially, but other species as well.
And I can also add that while we were doing these surveys, when we noticed that there was collapse, we actually recorded where they were so that Bush Heritage knows that a particular area might be losing its, say, Banksia media. So they could either go in and burn, or in some cases it looks like that they've been disappeared from the landscape for a long time, and maybe they'd have to actually literally put plants back in. They won't come from a seed bank now because that seed's not particularly long-lived. But they do have records of where they occur.
That's great. Thank you both for that. Final question now from Jane. I have an Acacia aphylla, A-P-H-Y-L-L-A, aphylla. I live in Melbourne. Is this shrub in danger, and what is the best way to look after it?
Sorry, could you repeat the name of the plant?
Acacia aphylla, A-P-H-Y-L-L-A.
I'm not familiar with it, I'm afraid. No.
Okay, sorry about that, Jane. I'm not too sure if we can provide too much information on that particular species. We do have a number of acacias out in our landscape, but not that one. So sorry about that. Look, I think we're just going to wrap things up now. Thank you both, Angela and Libby, for your contributions today. It's been fascinating. It's been really inspiring to know that we've got all of those species out in the landscape. I want to thank everyone for joining us on our live webinar today. And just to remind you that the webinar will be emailed to everyone in the next few days. So please share it with those who you think might be interested in our work and the work of Angela and Libby across the Fitz Stirling landscape. Look, I just want to maybe just finish off by asking Angela and Libby what perhaps is the most inspiring or exciting thing that you've seen this year. Is anything, I mean, it's been a challenging year for everyone across Australia and across the world indeed, but is there anything inspiring or exciting that you guys see to provide a bit of encouragement and excitement for the next year or two?
Okay, I'll start. I can't really comment on this year because I didn't work on the reserves this year. But what I think is amazing is just the sheer variety out there and the changes across such short distances. And that when you look at a map, we'll see that there's so many reserves and so many remnants of which we know so little about. So it's just so exciting. There's going to be much more out there for us to discover.
And Angela, anything from you?
Yeah, for me, Alex, it's I've been working towards reconnecting that landscape now for, a long time, since the 1990s in one form or another. And, because we've been successful in restoring a lot of fauna habitat out there, which has been very successful, I think that it's so exciting for me now to have the opportunity to see the next step, which is to give the animals a little bit more of a chance in that landscape by controlling introduced predators and also rabbits. So we've got a 5-year funded project at the moment where we're starting fox, cat and rabbit control in an integrated way across that landscape. And for me, that's, that's going to keep us going for a long time to come.
Fantastic. Great way to finish the presentation. And thank you both again for your time in this webinar. Look, just to all of our supporters, Bush Heritage remains committed to maintaining and improving our healthy country and to protect that landscape forever. We operate across the whole of Australia and we can't do that with the continued support of our donors, which remains forever vital to us continuing our important work. None of this work would be possible without that support and through regular donations and those sorts of things. So thank you again for that. And thanks again for joining us today. This is the final of our webinars for this year, 2020, but we hope to see you again next year in 2021. My name is Alex Hams. I'm the Healthy Landscapes Manager for the southwest of WA. And until next year, we'll see you then. Bye.
There's no one like you. You rip apart the clouds in all my days. Others all